Hi, my name is Quincie Leininger. For the class book talk, I chose to read James and the Giant Peach, written by Roald Dahl and illustrated by Nancy Elcombe Burkett. James and the Giant Peach is about a boy named James Henry Trotter. James lived on the beach with his two parents until one day when an angry rhinoceros had escaped from the zoo and they were eaten alive. After his parents were killed, he had to move in with his two aunts. His aunts were old and mean and had James do outrageous chores for a boy his age. One day, while James was wandering in the yard, an old man came out from the bushes. The old man gave James a small white bag with tiny crystals in it. The old man told James to go home and mix the crystals with water and 10 strands of his own hair. And he told James that after he drank the mixture, good, unbelievable things would happen to him. James was so excited and ran home. On his way home, he tripped and slipped and spilled all the crystals around the dead peach tree outside of his house. After spilling the bag and not being able to save any of the crystals, this was when his life changed for the best along with an extraordinary adventure. The main characters in the book are James, his two aunts, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker, and the other characters were insects. There was Old Green Grasshopper, the spider, the ladybug, a centipede, and an earthworm, and the giant peach. All these characters lived a dramatic life after having the crystals fall into their lap. Friendships and new adventures began for all of them that made this book very exciting for the reader. Some of the exciting points in this book is when James meets his friends and when their adventure begins. I'm going to read you some of the parts. On page 26, this is when he meets his friends. James' large, frightened eyes traveled slowly around the room. The creatures, some sitting on chairs, others reclining on a sofa, were all watching him intently. Creatures. Or were they insects? An insect is usually something rather small, is it not? A grasshopper, for example, is an insect. So what would you call it if you saw a grasshopper as large as a dog? As large as a large dog? Could you hardly call that an insect? Could you? There was an old green grasshopper as large as a large dog sitting on a stool directly across the room from James now. And next to the old green grasshopper there was an enormous spider, and next to the spider there was a giant ladybug with 9 black spots on her scarlet shell. Each of these 3 was squatting upon a magnificent chair. On a sofa nearby, reclining comfortably in a curled-up position, there was a centipede and an earthworm. On the floor, over in the far corner, there was something thick and white that looked as though it might be a silkworm. But it was sleeping soundly, and nobody was paying attention to it. Every one of these creatures was at least as big as James himself, and in the strange greenish light that shone down from above in the ceiling, they were absolutely terrifying to behold. I'm going to read you another passage. This is when their adventures start, when the peach started to roll down the hill. 1 second later, slowly, almost gently, the great peach started to lean toward and steal into motion. The whole room began to tilt over, and all the furniture went sliding across the floor, and crashed against the far wall. So did James, and the ladybug, and the old green grasshopper, and Miss Spider, and the earthworm. Also the centipede, who had just come slithering quickly down the wall. Outside, in the garden, at that very moment, Aunt Sponge and Aunt Spiker had just taken their places at the front gate, each with a bunch of tickets in their hand, and the first stream of early morning sightseers was visible in the distance climbing up the hill to view the peach. "We shall make a fortune today," Aunt Spiker was saying. "Just look at all those people." I wonder what become of that horrid little boy of ours last night," Aunt Sponge said. "He never did come back in, did he? He probably fell down in the dark and broke his leg," Aunt Spiker said, "or his neck, maybe," Aunt Sponge said hopefully. This book is on the American Banned Books list due to its violent language and inappropriate details relating to death and cruelty. For example, on page 2, it speaks about James's parents' death, and it gives vivid details. I will read you the passage. Now this, as we all can imagine, was a rather nasty experience for two such gentle parents, but in the long run it was far nastier for James than it was for them. Their troubles were all over in a jiffy. They were dead and gone in 35 seconds flat. They were dead and gone. Poor James, on the other hand, was still very much alive, and all at once he found himself alone and frightened in a vast unfriendly world. That is some of the examples of the vivid details that may be found inappropriate for young children to read. Let me find another passage. On page 3, this book displays cruelty by the way the ants speak to James and how they treat him with no respect. "The nasty little beast will only get into mischief if he goes out of the garden," Aunt Spiker had said, and terrible punishments were promised to him, such as being locked up in the cellar with the rats for a week if he even so dared to climb over the fence. Or on page 7, it displays cruelty. "Stop that immediately and get on with your work, you nasty little beast." "Oh, Aunt Sponge," James cried out, "and Aunt Spiker, couldn't we all please just for once go down to the seaside on the bus? It isn't very far, and I feel so hot and awful and lonely." "Why, you lazy, good-for-nothing brute," Aunt Spiker shouted. "Beat him," cried Aunt Sponge. "I certainly will." In this part, they're explaining that they're willing to harm James. This book also displays violence when the insect and James are trapped in the peach in the ocean and they're trying to find an escape route. And this is on page 62. And far below, in the great hollow stone of the peach, the glow-worm was lighting up the room so that the two spinners, the silkworm and Miss Spider, could see what they were doing. The centipede was down there too, exhorting them both frantically to greater efforts, and every now and again James could hear his voice coming up faintly from the depths, shouting, "Spin, silkworm, spin, you great fat lazy brute, faster, faster, or we'll feed you to the sharks." This book is banned due to cruelty, references, and language content of being mean and saying things that are not appropriate for certain age levels. I want to thank you for listening to my book talk. I hope that I encourage you to read this book. It is very exciting and very adventurous for young people that are interested in insects and creating future relationships. Thank you.